4. Relations between the Italian left and the Communist International. The Rome Congress, held in March 1922, brought to light a theoretical divergence between the Italian left and most of the International, a divergence expressed before, rather badly, by our delegations at the Third World Congress and the enlarged executive of February 1922, where, especially on the first occasion, errors of leftist nature were committed. Fortunately, the Rome Theses constituted the theoretical and political liquidation of any peril of left-wing opportunism in the Italian party. The only difference in practice between the party and the International was about what tactics to follow with regard to the Maximalists, but the Unitarian victory at the Socialist Congress in October 1921 appeared to have settled this. The Rome Theses were adopted as the party's contribution to the International's decision-making, not as an immediate line of action. This was confirmed by the party directorate at the enlarged executive of 1922, and if no theoretical discussion took place there, this was because of a decision by the International which for discipline's sake the party complied with. In August 1922, however, the International wouldn't interpret the Italian situation in same way as the party directorate, but concluded that the situation in Italy was unstable in terms of a weakening of state resistance. It therefore thought that a fusion with the Maximalists would strengthen the party, considering the split between the Maximalists and Unitarians as decisive, as opposed to the party directorate that wished to apply the lessons learnt during the vast strike maneuver in August. It is from this moment that the two political lines diverge in a definitive way. At the Fourth World Congress in December 1922, the old leadership opposed the majority thesis, and on returning to Italy, the delegates would pass the matter to a commission, unanimously declining to take any responsibility for the decision, though of course retaining their own administrative functions. Then came the arrests in February 1923 and the big offensive against the party. Finally, the enlarged executive of June 1923 would depose the old executive and replace it with a completely different one. Several party leaders would simply resign as a logical consequence. In May 1924, a party consultative conference still gave the left an overwhelming majority over the center and the right, and thus it arrived at the Fifth World Congress in 1924. 5. The ordinarist tradition of the present leadership. The Ordine Nuovo group was formed in turn by a group of intellectuals, who established contacts with the proletarian masses and industry at a time when the abstentionist fraction in Turin already had a large following. The volatile ideology of this group is mainly derived from philosophical conceptions of a bourgeois and idealist nature partly inherited from Benedetto Croce. This group aligned itself with communist directives very late in the day, and would always display residual errors linked to its origins. It understood the significance of the Russian Revolution too late to be able to apply it usefully to the proletarian struggle in Italy. In November 1917, Comrade Gramsci published an article in Avanti, asserting that the Russian Revolution had given the lie to Marx's historical materialism and the theories in Capital, and gave an essentially idealist explanation. The extreme left current that the Youth Federation belonged to responded immediately to this article. The subsequent ideological development of the Ordinarist group, as their publication Ordine Nuovo shows, has led to a non-Marxist and non-Leninist interpretation of the workers' movement. The questions of the role of the unions and the party, armed struggle and conquest of power, and the construction of socialism are not posed correctly in their theory, and they have evolved instead the conception of a systematic organization of the laboring classes which was necessary rather than voluntary, and strictly bound up with the mechanism of capitalist industrial production. Setting out from the internal commissions, this system was supposed to culminate simultaneously in the proletarian and communist international, in the Soviets and in the workers' state by way of the factory councils, which were held to embody the latter even before the collapse of capitalist power. And what is more, even during the bourgeois epoch, this system was supposed to assume the function of constructing the new economy by calling for and exercising workers' control over production. Later on, all the non-Marxist aspects of Ordinarist ideology, utopianism, Proudhon-inspired syndicalism, and economic gradualism before the conquest of power, that is, reformism, were apparently dropped in order to be gradually substituted with the entirely different theories of Leninism. However, the fact that this substitution took place on a superficial and fictitious level could only have been avoided if the ordinarists hadn't split from and opposed the left, a group whose traditions, rather than converging with the Bolsheviks in an entirely impulsive way, represented a serious contribution, derived not from academic and bookish dissertations on bourgeois tomes but from proletarian class experience. Certainly the ordinarists hadn't been prevented from learning and improving within the strictly collaborative framework which was lacking later on. As it turned out, we greeted the announcements of the ordinarist leaders with a certain tinge of irony when they announced that they were Bolshevizing the very people who had actually set them on the road to Bolshevik positions by serious and Marxist means, rather than by chattering about mechanistic and bureaucratic procedures. Up until shortly before the 1920 World Congress, the ordinarists were opposed to a split in the old party, and they posed all trade union questions incorrectly. The International's representative in Italy had to polemicize against them on the questions of the factory councils and the premature constitution of the Soviets. In April 1920, the Turin section approved the famous Ordine Nuovo theses, which were drawn up by Comrade Gramsci and adopted by a committee composed of both ordinarists and abstentionists. These theses, cited in the Second Congress's resolution, in fact expressed, despite disagreements about elections, the common thinking of the nascent communist fraction. They weren't distinctly ordinarist positions, but consisted of points already clarified and accepted by the party's left wing long before. The ordinarists would rally around the left's positions on the International for a while, but the thinking expressed in the Rome Theses was essentially different from theirs, even if they considered it opportune to vote for them. The true precursor of ordinarivism's present adherence to the tactics and general line of the International was really Comrade Tosca and his opposition to the left at the Rome Congress. Given, on the one hand, the ordinarist group's characteristic particularism and its taste for the concrete inherited from idealistic bourgeois positions, and, on the other hand, the superficial and therefore incomplete adherences allowed for by the International's leadership, we are forced to conclude, despite all of their loud protestations of orthodoxy, that the theoretical adherence, of decisive importance in terms of providing a basis for actual policies, of the ordinarists to Leninism is about as worthless as their adherence to the Rome Theses. 6. The political work of the present party leadership. From 1923 until now, the work of the party leadership, which we must bear in mind took place in difficult circumstances, has led to mistakes which are essentially similar to those pointed out apropos the international question, but which have been severely aggravated at least partly by the initial ordinarist deviations. Participating in the 1924 elections was a very fortunate political act, but one cannot say the same about the proposal for joint action with the socialist parties nor of the way it was labeled proletarian unity. Just as deplorable was the excessive tolerance shown towards some of the Terzini's electoral maneuvers. But the most serious problems are posed apropos the open crisis that followed Matteotti's assassination. The leadership's policies were based on the absurd view that the weakening of fascism would propel the middle classes into action first, and then the proletariat. This implied on the one hand a lack of faith in the capacity of the proletariat to act as a class, despite its continued alertness under the suffocating strictures of fascism, and on the other, an overestimation of the initiative of the middle class. In fact, even without referring to the clear Marxist theoretical positions on this matter, the central lesson to draw from the Italian experience has been that the intermediary layers will passively tail along behind the strongest and may therefore back either side. Thus in 1919 to 1920 they backed the proletariat, then between 1921, 22, 23 they went behind fascism, and now, after a significant period of major upheaval in 1924-25, they are backing fascism again. The leadership were mistaken in abandoning Parliament and participating in the first meetings of the Aventine when they should have remained in Parliament, launched a political attack on the government, and immediately taken up a position opposed to the moral and constitutional prejudices of the Aventine, which would determine the outcome of the crisis in fascism's favor. This wouldn't have prevented the Communists from making the decision to abandon parliament, and would have allowed them to do so whilst keeping their specific identity intact, and allowed them to leave at the only appropriate time, that is when the situation was ripe to call on the masses to take direct action. It was one of those crucial moments which affect how future situations will turn out. The error was therefore a fundamental one, a decisive test of the leadership's capabilities, and it led to a highly unfavorable utilization by the working class both of the weakening of fascism and the resounding failure of the Aventine. The return to Parliament in November 1924 and the statement issued by Repassi were beneficial, as the wave of proletarian consensus showed, but they came too late. The leadership wavered for a long time, and only finally made a decision under pressure from the party and the left. The preparation of the party was made on the basis of dreary directives and a fantastically erroneous assessment of the situation's latent possibilities. Report by Gramsci to the Central Committee, August 1924. The preparation of the masses, which led towards supporting the Aventine rather than wishing for its collapse, was in any case made worse when the party proposed to the opposition parties that they set up their own anti-parliament. This tactic in any case conflicted with the decisions of the International, which never envisaged proposals being made to parties which were clearly bourgeois. Worse still, it lay totally outside the domain of communist principles and tactics, and outside the Marxist conception of history. Any possible explanation that the leadership might have had for this tactic aside, an explanation which was doomed to have very limited repercussions anyway, there is no doubt that it presented the masses with an illusory anti-state, opposed to and warring against the traditional state apparatus, whilst in the historical perspective of our program, there is no basis for an anti-state other than the representation of the one productive class, namely, the Soviet. To call for an anti-parliament, relying in the country on the support of the workers' and peasants' committees, meant entrusting the leadership of the proletariat to representatives of groups that are socially capitalist, like Amendola, Agnelli, Albertini, etc. Besides the certainty that such a situation won't arise, a situation which could only be described as a betrayal anyway, just putting it forward in the first place as a point of view derived from a communist proposal involves a betrayal of principles and a weakening of the revolutionary preparation of the proletariat. Other aspects of the work of the leadership also lend themselves to criticism. There has been a welter of watchwords that correspond neither to any genuine possibility of realization, nor to any visible signs of agitation outside the party machine. The core demand for workers' and peasants' committees, justified in a confusing and contradictory way, has been neither understood nor abided by. 7. The party's trade union activity. During the March 1925 metal workers' strike another serious mistake was made. The leadership should have predicted that the proletariat's disillusionment with the Aventine would propel it into class actions and a wave of strikes. If the leadership had foreseen this, it might have been possible to push the FIOM into a national strike, just as it had managed to get it to take part in the strike initiated by the fascists, by setting up a metal workers' agitation committee based on the local organizations, which throughout the country had been highly supportive of the strike. The stance the leadership has taken on the trade unions hasn't corresponded clearly with the watchword of trade union unification inside the Confederation, a watchword that should still be adhered to despite the organizational decomposition of the latter. The party's directives on the unions have shown evidence of ordinavist errors as regards action in the factories. Not only has it created, or is proposing to create, a multitude of conflicting organisms in the factories, but it has frequently issued watchwords which depreciate trade unions and the idea of their necessity as organs of proletarian struggle. A consequence of this error was the paltry settlement with Fiat in Turin, as was the confusions surrounding the factory elections, where the criteria for choosing between classist or party lists of candidates, that is on trade union terrain, wasn't posted correctly. 8. Party activity in agrarian and national matters. It is quite correct to have issued the call for the formation of peasant defense associations, but this work has been conducted too exclusively from on high by a party bureau. Despite the situation's inherent difficulties, it is necessary to declare that viewing our tasks in this area in a bureaucratic way is dangerous. Indeed, the same goes for every other party activity. A correct relationship between peasant associations and workers' unions must be clearly established along the following lines. Whilst agricultural wage laborers must form a federation which adheres to the Confederación del Lavaro, a strict alliance must exist between the latter and the peasant defense associations at both the central and local levels. All regionalist, and particularly Southernist, conceptions, and there is already some evidence of this, must be avoided when dealing with the agrarian question. This is equally true with regard to the demands for regional autonomy which have been advanced by certain new parties, who we must fight openly as reactionaries, instead of sitting around the table with them engaging in pointless negotiations. The tactic of seeking an alliance with the left wing of the Popular Party, Miglioli, and the Peasants' Party has not given favorable results. Once again concessions have been made to politicians who are outside any classist tradition, without obtaining the expected shift in the masses. This has, on the contrary, often disorientated parts of our organization. It is equally wrong to overestimate the significance of the maneuvers amongst the peasantry for a hypothetical political campaign against the influence of the Vatican. The problem certainly exists, but it won't be resolved adequately by such means. 9. The leadership's organizational work. There is no doubt that the work of reorganizing the party after the fascist storm has produced some excellent results. However, it has retained an overly technical character. Instead of ensuring centralization by means of clear and uniform statutory norms applicable to every comrade and local committee, the attempt was made to enforce it solely by means of interventions by the central apparatus. It would have been a major step forward to have allowed the base organizations to return to electing their own committees, especially during the periods when the circumstances most favored it. Regarding the increase, then the subsequent decrease, in the party's membership, not to mention the departure of elements recruited during the Matteotti crisis who are leaving with the same facility as they arrived, it goes to show how matters such as these depend on changing circumstances rather than on any hypothetical advantages that a general change of direction might have. The effects and advantages of the month-long campaign of recruitment have been exaggerated. As for organization at the level of the cell, evidently the leadership must put into effect the Comintern's general resolutions, a matter we have already referred to elsewhere. However, it has been done in an irregular and uneven fashion involving a host of contradictions, and only after much pressure from the rank and file has a certain accommodation been reached. It would be better if the system of interregional secretaries was substituted with a corps of inspectors, thereby establishing direct links which were political rather than technical between the leadership and the traditional rank-and-file organizations of the party, that is, the provincial federations. The principal duty of the inspector should be to actively intervene when the fundamental party organization needs to be rebuilt, and then look after and assist it until normal functioning is established. 10. The leadership and the question of fractionism. The campaign which reached its climax during the preparation for our Third Congress, and which was deliberately launched after the Fifth World Congress, rather than aiming to propagandize and elaborate on the directives of the International throughout the party with the aim of creating a really collective and advanced consciousness, aimed instead to get comrades to renounce their adhesion to the opinions of the left as quickly as possible and with minimum effort. No thought was given to whether this would be useful or damaging to the party with regard to its effectiveness toward the external enemy. The only objective was that of attaining by any means this internal objective. We have spoken elsewhere, from a historical and theoretical perspective, about the delusion of repressing fractionism from above. The Fifth Congress, in the case of Italy, accepted that the left were refraining from working as an opposition although still participating in all aspects of party work, except within the political leadership, and it therefore agreed that pressure on them from above should be stopped. This agreement was however broken by the leadership in a campaign which consisted not of ideological postulates and tactics, but of disciplinary accusations towards individual comrades who were brought before federal congresses and focused on in a one-sided way. On the announcement of the Congress, An Entente Committee was spontaneously constituted with the aim of preventing individuals and groups from reacting by leaving the party, and in order to channel the action of all the left comrades into a common and responsible line, within the strict limits of discipline, with the proviso that the rights of all comrades to be involved in party consultations was guaranteed. This action was seized on by the leadership, who launched a campaign which portrayed the comrades of the left as fractionists and scissionists, whose right to defend themselves was withdrawn and against whom votes were obtained from the federal committees by exerting pressure from above. This campaign continued with a fractionist revision of the party apparatus and of the local cadres, through the way in which written contributions to the discussion were presented, and by the refusal to allow representatives of the left to participate in the federal congresses. Crowning it all, there was the unheard-of system of automatically attributing the votes of all those absent from conference to the theses of the leadership. Whatever the effect of such measures may be in terms of producing a simple numerical majority, in fact, rather than enhancing the ideological consciousness of the party and its prestige amongst the masses, they have damaged it. If the worst consequences have been avoided, this is due to the moderation of the comrades of the left, who have put up with such a hammering not because they believed it to be in the least bit justified, but solely because they are devoted to the party cause. 11. Draft Program of Party Work. The premises from which, in the left's view, the general and particular duties of the party should spring, are defined in the preceding theses. It is evident, however, that the question can only be tackled on the basis of international decisions. The left can therefore only outline a draft program of action as a proposal to the International about how the tasks of its Italian section might best is realized. The party must prepare the proletariat for a revival of its classist activity and for the struggle against fascism by drawing on the harsh experiences of recent times. At the same time, we need to disenchant the proletariat of the notion that there is anything to be gained from a change in bourgeois politics, or that any help will be forthcoming from the urban middle classes. The experiences of the liberal democratic period can be used to prevent the re-emergence of these pacifistic illusions. The party will address no proposals for joint actions to the parties of the anti-fascist opposition, neither will it engage in politics aimed at detaching a left wing from this opposition, and nor will it attempt to push so-called left-wing parties further to the left. In order to mobilize the masses around its program, the party will subscribe to the tactic of the united front from below and will keep an attentive eye on the economic situation in order to formulate immediate demands. The party will refrain from advocating as a central political demand the accession of a government that concedes guarantees of liberty. It will not put forward liberty for all as an objective of class conquest, but will emphasize on the contrary that freedom for the workers will entail infringing the liberties of the exploiters and the bourgeoisie. Faced today with the grave problem of a weakening of the class unions and of the other immediate organs of the proletariat, the party will call for the defense of the traditional red unions and for the necessity of their rebirth. In its work in the factories, it will avoid creating organs if they tend to undermine this rebuilding of the trade unions. Taking the present situation into account, the party will work towards getting the unions to operate within the framework of union factory sections, which, representing a strong union tradition, are the appropriate bodies for leading workers' struggles insofar as today it is precisely in the factories where opportunities for struggle exist. We will attempt to get the illegal internal commissions elected through the union factory section, with the reservation that, as soon as it is possible, it isn't at present, the committees be elected by an assembly of the factory personnel. As regards the question of organization in the countryside, reference can be made to what we have said regarding the agrarian situation. Once all the possibilities for proletarian groups to organize have been utilized to the maximum, we may resort to the watchword workers' and peasants' committees observing the following criteria. A. The watchword of constituting workers' and peasants' committees must not be launched in a casual and intermittent way, but set forth in an energetic campaign when a changing situation has made the need for a new framework clear to the masses, that is, when the watchword can be identified not just as a call to organize, but as a definite call to action. B. The nucleus of the committees will have to be constituted by representatives from the traditional mass organizations, such as the unions and analogous organisms, despite these having been mutilated by reaction. It must not include convocations of political delegates. c. At a later date we'll be able to call on the committees to have elections, but we will have to clarify beforehand that these are not soviets, that is organs of proletarian government, but expressions of a local and national alliance of all the exploited for their joint defense. Regarding relations with fascist unions, inasmuch as today the latter don't present themselves even in a formal sense as voluntary associations of the masses, there must be an overall rejection of the call to penetrate these unions in order to break them up. The watchword of the rebuilding the Red Unions must be issued in conjunction with the denunciation of the fascist unions. The organizational measures that should be adopted inside the party have been indicated in part. Under present conditions, it is necessary to coordinate such measures with requirements that we can't go into here, clandestinity. It is nevertheless an urgent necessity that they are systematized and formulated as clear statutory norms binding on all in order to avoid confusing healthy centralism with blind obedience to arbitrary and conflicting instructions, a method which puts genuine party unity in jeopardy. 12. Perspectives on the party's internal situation. The internal political and organizational problems which our party faces cannot be resolved in a definitive way within the national framework, as the solution depends on the working out of the internal situation and on the politics of the international as a whole. It would a serious and shameful mistake if the national and international leaders continue to deploy the stupid method of exerting pressure from above against the left and the reduction of complex problems of party politics and ideology to cases of personal conduct. Since the left is going to stick to its opinions, those comrades who have no intention of renouncing them should be allowed, in an atmosphere free of scheming and mutual recriminations, to carry out the loyal commitment they have given. That is, to abide by the decisions of the party organs and to renounce all oppositional work, whilst being exempted from the requirement of participating in the leadership. Evidently this proposal shows that the situation is far from perfect, but it would be dangerous to delude the party that these internal difficulties can be eliminated by simply applying mechanical measures to organizational problems, or by taking up personal positions. To spread such an illusion would be tantamount to making a severe attack on the party. Only by abandoning this small-minded approach, appreciating the true magnitude of the problem, and placing it before the party and the international, will we truly achieve the aim of avoiding a poisoning of the party atmosphere and move on to tackle all the difficulties which the party is called on to face today.